In the following episode of Ventures with David, I had a wonderful conversation with Dan McKinley, former Vice President of Engineering at Mozilla and Principal Engineer at Etsy and Mailchimp, among other organizations. Dan has a unique way of presenting the pitfalls of managing teams in tech companies. He combines humor with a direct way of presenting the core of these problems. Join me to learn how to design better organizations and how to increase the productivity of teams based on a leadership style that combines empathy, humility, and data. I hope this chapter is useful for you. If it is, please subscribe and leave your comments on YouTube or LinkedIn. See you around.
I wound up titling the talk that because I think what goes through is my experiences in different companies, how they'd organize themselves differently. I worked at to a mid-sized growth stage B2B company, and then an older, more established tech company that had a big hit early on and was searching around for other stuff. They'd all organize themselves differently, but I'd noticed the ways that organizational dysfunction arose in those companies. They weren't all the same, but they all rhymed. Go into much more detail in the talk on different species of things that went wrong or were going wrong. Incidentally, also go through one of the times that things went really right, in my opinion, and contrasting those two things. The human impulses at the root of things not going well at work, to me, were the yin and yang of parochialism and ego. And these are just your baseline instinct level ways that you behave with other people. I think ego has a negative connotation, but it doesn't always, and parochialism too, but they have upsides and downsides. So like you have instincts for parochialism and ego, where parochialism might be giving a lot of deference to other people at work. That person's the front end engineer, so don't ask me. Go ask them. It could be like that, or it could be lack of curiosity. These are two ways to characterize the baseline impulse, and ego is the same thing. That could be wholesome pride, or this sense that the work I do is really important and complicated, like site reliability engineering. How complicated could that be? That sounds easy.
I
um,
see. Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
I saw these things like manifest, like, and to be clear, like within myself at like earlier times in my career, it's like these are not just the great ghosts that haunt me. I'm also describing the ghosts that haunt me that were myself. There are times in my career where I was very much like a kind of engineer that thinks all problems are reducible to engineering. I was like that when I was younger. I I definitely had that streak. And I think the times in my career when things really started to go well, the times when we broke down those kinds of instincts the hardest and dedicated ourselves to doing that. That's really when the magic happens. And it's like I'm describing part of my career I think about all the time. That was Etsy.com, kind of like I started at Etsy in 2007, left in 2014.
Hmm.
Kind of the golden era that I describe kind of was like through maybe 2009 through when I left or around then. So that was maybe from like 20 employees up to like maybe 300 in engineering and product. And then let's say maybe like 600 total, something like that. So it was pretty relatively large
Hmm.
group of people. I'm still in contact with a lot of them. And like we all just kind of think about that as like, yeah, I didn't realize how special that was at the time. And kind of the talk came out of having dinner with a designer who was there at the same time as me and just talking about like, yeah, I've just been trying to recreate that every place I've been since. And he was the same. And he's the head of design at some company now. He's like, yeah, I'm trying to tell everybody, no, like designers should be able to ship their own CSS changes. And everybody's looking at me like I'm crazy. And I'm just like, I know, right? I thought I would take a swing at describing what the magic was like and help people paint a better picture of what good looks like when it comes to people working with each other.
Got it. Thank you for describing your pathway. I wonder if your experience working in small teams and then seeing how those small organizations grew to a more corporate environment allowed you to see what works and what doesn't. At the moment of working with small teams, you notice the same issues over and over. One of the things that I agree with you in your presentation that is on LinkedIn for everyone who wants to look at it. The issues of dividing responsibility are, if I interpreted correctly what you said in the presentation, that you have certain coordination costs. You cannot make everything parallel. You still need to go with empathy to understand what the other is doing. Do you observe that while working in a small organization, in a small Etsy, and then the same happen on the big Etsy, or was all the same all the moment?
It's definitely not as simple as things work on small teams and then don't scale up, because things can also not work on small teams. That's the overall arc that Etsy went through. When I started in 2007, I was in the first 20 employees, but they'd stratified themselves, right? The engineering team was 10-ish, maybe half the team's engineers or something, somewhere around there. And then, but they'd managed to set themselves up so they couldn't ship anything. And that, I don't know, complicated story about how they got there. Lots of scar tissue, lots of screaming at one another.
I imagine.
It was for real. I'm not talking shit about the engineering founders or anything. They did something incredible, but they kind of wedged themselves into a corner around the time I was starting, where to do anything, there's a DBA, this middle tier written in Python, and then a PHP application that was sitting on top of the Python, and then there's front end stuff. And they'd kind of just like, everybody retreated to their corners. It was like, I do all of the JavaScript here. And then I do all of the stored procedures in the database. That's a different guy. They kind of carved out these fiefdoms that made it impossible to do anything. Everybody in this story was very young. I don't know if there's some other way to solve it, but the thing that was true at the time was that the investors owned a lot more of the company than would be normal through most of the 2010s. And so they raptured the engineering founders out of there and scrambled the whole thing up. So like it was definitely a very small team. Things were not working very well. And then I've certainly been on, or nearly every large team that I've been on, things have also not been working very well. Etsy did kind of, I would say, like, it had many other problems as a business. The engineering execution was its real strong point, and it got that going from like a rebuilding era of a team less than 20 up to, 300 people who stayed there through 2017 or so. Still speak fondly of those years. So there's almost like an 8-year period where things are going pretty well, up through hundreds of people. Investment of active energy into making that true was the thing that did it. I think one of the key themes of the talk here is that your question was about division of responsibility. And I think the key takeaway for me is like the divisions of labor are better blurry than they are sharp. So if you're working on it, things are best when you can carry water for each other, however you define the team, right? And the more broadly your definition of team identity, the better off you are. The more broadly someone can conceive of their in-group, the people I'm going to try and help deeply understand and make more efficient, the better off you are. Things reach scaling limits at some point. You have to, once you have 2 employees, you have a division of labor problem. So there's no magic answer that scales up infinitely or anything like that. But those are the things to pay attention to. And you can mess up and have everybody in their corner behind a ticket queue at 5 people, or you can do that at 500 people. I've never worked on an engineering team much bigger than that, so can't talk to Facebook's problems or anything like that. But that's the general thing. And then, like you mentioned, the talk, there are insights in computer science that can help us here, right? Because what do computers do? They do work. And what is computer science about? Organizing that work. But we don't think too hard. We do our best to avoid dragging ink and paper into thinking about human work. And it's kind of to our detriment because, for example, there are limits to parallelism, right? And that is generally applied to like, well, if we add more CPUs to this problem, is it going to make things happen faster? Maybe yes, maybe no. The key problem is you need to coordinate what all those CPUs are doing, and that's work that can swamp the other work, right? But, same principles apply to human beings or teams of human beings. And then Kigman's formula comes out of queuing theory, and that's how we've got a shared resource and contention for it. What happens if we increase the contention for it? Well, it's kind of surprising. These are all useful things when thinking about Google PubSub, but we kind of turn our brains off when thinking about the team of data scientists. These are general mathematical results that can be applied to lots of things. I would argue should be, but understanding the mindset of just wanting to worry about the computers.
That was one of the surprising definitions of computer science. I'm an industrial engineer, and I feel both industrial engineering, like the fact that you need to organize resources, and the computer science are very connected because they share a common goal. I guess industrial engineering diverted a little more towards the human side, like the management side, and computer science focus on the abstract part. And I think it's reasonable to think on the division of labor in those two sciences, but to make work efficient, you need to consider both at the same time. And I want to go back to one of your main points on solving this issue on dividing responsibility. So you said that you have an organization where empathy, like carrying the water for the other, not consider that my role is more important than yours, that definitely changed the vibe and changes the issues of dividing everything in a sharp manner. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said for just not abiding that kind of attitude. The kind of attitude being like, there are prima donnas in tech, there have been forever, right? There's the industry archetype of like the 25X programmer or whatever Joel Spolsky called it 25 years ago. And I think that myth dies hard. We're not trying to make an individual at a company the most efficient nearly all the time. What we're trying to do is make teams go, and those things trade against each other. If you let people get away with egregious behaviors, that's the culture you have, regardless of what culture you want, right? So I think that I've just seen a lot of that. It's just a bad idea to abide prima donna is for its own sake. It makes people feel bad. It's not the right thing to do, but it also makes things less efficient. It makes you less successful because people leave. There's this cycle you can get into where we have this guy who's a jerk. It's generally a guy. There's a guy who's really difficult to work with, but he seems so important that we can't do anything about it. That is cyclical. That person seems important because they're driving out everybody else who might contribute. And I've seen that a bunch of times. And I think it's still worth complaining.
I totally agree. If you don't call out those behaviors, they become just accepted and nobody kind of thinks differently. In your speech, you talk about misery proxy metric. And I think the title is catchy and powerful. Misery is a shitty proxy metric for measuring how well you're doing as a firm, startup, of whatever. How do you think is the best way that managers can identify when teams' stress is being misinterpreted as productivity? And what have you saw in your experience that helps change this perception of, oh yeah, we need to be grinding and grinding and grinding and feel that we're successful when we're just burning people and basically burning the ships for the futures?
I'd encourage people to look within themselves. That's one of the themes of the talk. Leaders, look within yourselves. You're going to get what you reward, or you're going to get what you ask for, and you're going to get it hard. Right now, companies do not need to compete on employee experience like they may have needed to 3 or 4 years ago. There was this summer when everything kind of changed suddenly, where like I was in charge of a large org at the time, and it's like went into the summer with getting yelled at that we weren't hiring fast enough, and then by the end of the summer it's like stop hiring. Stop hiring. And that I think was relatively global phenomenon for whatever reason that changed conditions that people are working in, where it's like, I don't know, the cartoon version of this is like free snacks or whatever, but there's other things in work experience that could be mistaken for perks. So things like hack weeks, where hack week being like everybody at the company just, pause what you're doing normally. Let's do a big mixer where we just do something weird, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or like boot camps, which is something we did at Etsy for a long time. I've talked to people who've been there now and they're like, yeah, they died out. Just stop doing them. And it's a shame because they were great. But boot camps were like, you'd join the company and then you'd have this period of onboarding where you'd do a tour of a bunch of different teams you weren't going to work on. And then you do that to get a broader sense of what the company was like than just your team, right? And then we would also do senior rotations every year. On the month that you joined the company, you'd work on some other team for a couple of weeks to just keep mixing it up, right? And those are things that made people happy. And I think there's this horrible mistake that people can make in the current climate, which is to devolve to this shorthand where it's like fun, waste of time, right? Because no, these things are fun. That makes them really effective at what the goals were. Expand people's horizons, make them understand what the point of the company was, understand what other people's problems at the company were, so they can help each other be more effective as a team. And I think it's just, I consider it lazy to be like, well, hack weeks are fun. We're trying to get shit done here. Like, I consider that to be a lazy way of thinking, and would just encourage people to think twice, cut once when it comes to things that look like perks, because it's ahistorical to me to really think about these things as just perks. Like, they could be misinterpreted that way, but we started doing those things in my career in 2009 in New York City, where you could not raise money. It was so much harder to hire and raise money. The conditions kind of like now. We started doing those because we needed to be efficient. We didn't start doing them because we were trying to retain people. Yes, they were fun, but winning feels fun. I'm not saying feeling fun is the precondition for winning exactly, but consider that if you're winning, like, it should feel fun. It shouldn't feel like you're bludgeoning people to death. And those are my thoughts on that.
I believe that managers are not very thoughtful about how they incentivize behaviors in organizational settings. And one of the things that attracted my attention was when you start talking about DevOps and breaking down divides. You mentioned the concept of DevOps being about breaking down this division between development and operations. Yet many companies still struggle to implement it. From a management perspective, how can leaders encourage true collaboration between teams that traditionally have different goals and cultures? You mentioned one aspect, which is fostering empathy, that there is no sharp division of labor rather than collaboration across the organization. That's one thing I understand from you just said. Another part is it comes from management, which is incentivizing and thinking about what the organization calls perks. But still in DevOps, I feel my perception is that people don't understand what is DevOps. People think that DevOps is a tool, a software, but people think it's just automatizing things. So what has worked to actually break these silos between development and operations from your standpoint or experience?
DevOps is something that followed a fairly baffling trajectory to me. Where it began, there's a number of people who claim they created it. The one that I believe, friends of mine, John Oswald and Paul Hammond, did a talk in 2008 at Velocity conference, which was a great conference. We should just do Velocity 2008 every year, maybe. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. But like, they stood on stage, they did a talk called 10 deploys a day, Dev and Ops cooperation at Flickr. Flickr was still very much a serious internet company at the time. It's not really now, but at the time it was like number 18 biggest website in the world. And like, those two guys stood on stage and said, yo, I'm John. Yo, I'm Paul. Even though we have different jobs, we're friends. We try to help each other. Isn't that weird? This was pushing against what had been ordinary, certainly to me in my career to that point, and ordinary everywhere else, which is just like, there's a brick wall between building stuff and then running it in production. And the people who build stuff heave it over the wall and complain about the people who run it in production. And like, the people who run it in production think developers are naive and whatever. Just like all of this dysfunction that you'd recognize across any brick wall between any two teams anywhere. What those two people did was try to make it easy for John, the ops person, to add logging to the code base if he needs to. Or, sometimes John's behind on what he's doing, and we make it easy for Paul, the developer, to write some init scripts or the things that the machines need to run in production. We just blur the line between these things, and it's magical, right? And that's all the word meant, which is why they made a portmanteau out of it, like DevOps. Maybe the marketing was just too good and all of this was inevitable, but I think it got really out of hand at in the industry at large from there. Where
Just a little bit.
DevOps was variously the new word for the people on the other side of the brick wall in production. So we need a DevOps engineer, which means we need a person to do all the production stuff so that I don't need to worry about any of that, which is the opposite of what it meant. Or DevOps became like a set of tools you would buy. So like, I need DevOps, I'm going to buy some vendor that does something like Terraform or whatever, which is fine, but a weird way to put that because there's no technology per se in the portmanteau. The entire thing is just the concept that you blur the line between building stuff and running it. And you get good at doing them both at once, right? And so I think that is the founding text of my religion. And I think what leaders could do to be better at that is just do a better job of centering the human relationships, which were the whole point of it, right? It wasn't a tool. Yeah, I don't know. It may be lost at this point as a term, and maybe we need to come up with a new one. But that's all it was. If you're ops person and you're yelling at each other, you should try and make them stop doing that. Try and make them hug it out.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
seen many conflicting relationships between development and operations, and I still doubt that that could happen. And it impressed me that when you clarify the origin of the concept DevOps, more than just software or a hard skill, is actually a way of collaborating. In the joyful way you express it, which is two friends or two people working as friends, trying to collaborate, it feels like a more accurate and defined way. I would like to ask you about something that it's, for me, particularly problematic, and it might be contributed to the problem of division, of like having these walls between development, operations, data science, and product, and whatever, which is the way we hire people. I think you mentioned in your presentation, the way we hire people is I imagine the manager saying, oh, we need a DevOps engineer, product manager, or data scientist. Positions created are not necessarily congruent with the workload, not necessarily reduce the amount of grinding in the organization, to define a strict way. Oh, you are going to do just this. But in reality, what happens is the new hire, required to be effective at communicating between two tribes. Do you think this is accurate? This is something I perceive, and it's more a call for people on HR.
Data science is an interesting case. The center of mass of my career has been in data science. When I started doing that, it wasn't a word yet. I remember we hired somebody who'd been a sociologist to like do some math for us. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And then we tried to teach that person to code. That was neat. But word for that person yet, I dusted off my stats books from college and relearned the stats that I needed to do various things. And that's what I was doing. It was this amorphous continuum between stats professor and product hacker at the beginning. And then, that was like 2009 or so. And then you fast forward 10 years and it's like, it's a major you can have in some places. I don't know if that's literally true or not, but
Yep, it is.
you can go to school to become a data scientist now, and it's a whole corpus of things that you can specialize in. And then that means that it becomes a title you can have in a company, distinct from engineer. The sociologist that we hired would have been engineer, like an oddly shaped engineer for sure, but that was normal for us because we had lots of oddly shaped engineers, and that's fine. It's like a title you can have, and it's like a team of people with that title that you can be mad at or whatever. Like they can sit behind a ticket queue and receive data science requests from you, however you define that. Obviously, some of that's necessary and some of it's not, but the thing that everybody kind of did in the interim was forget the continuum. I think keeping hold of the continuum was key. And I was in charge of a data science team. I endeavored to pay attention to the mix of stats professor versus engineer that learned a bunch of stats and be deliberate about what that composition was and things like that. I think outside of data science, you see the same things with SRE, which developed independently at Google around the same time DevOps was happening everywhere else. But like those things are kind of, maybe everywhere else kind of adopted SRE as like a successor term to DevOps, is like, right, we're going to be this. distinguish ourselves from sysadmins now. And then production engineering is maybe supplanting SRE or whatever. But it's like those things, same thing. It's like there's a team of people. It was a continuum, like the intent of the words DevOps or site reliability engineering is meant to draw attention to the fact that there's like this continuum. And then the first thing people do is like, all right, well, we need some of those. That's a title. They sit on this team. I give them work via tickets. Letting things break down that way is the mistake. Once they're behind a ticket queue and you stop empathizing with them and they stop empathizing with you, you're doomed. That's the problem to fix.
Yeah, absolutely. Once you start seeing them as a service provider and somebody to be mad with. My first experiences was being a junior data scientist, and it was literally that. I was the pain sponge for senior data scientists when things didn't work. And then I noticed why my position was created to begin with, if what you actually needed was to mediate a relationship that was failing between data science and product. It happens that I ended up doing more of that, like speaking the jargon of product managers and data scientists, and come up to terms on how we don't necessarily need to get angry or emotional before we solve things. I would like to ask you a final question. All you have sent for me has been super insightful. Oftentimes, as engineers, we're thinking in the matrix, but we don't think about the design of the matrix, the design of the organizations that we are embedded into. And I want to ask you about what kind of skills young engineers should cultivate to succeed in this moment where it is predominantly calling for change in the tech industry, right? I feel that one of the big messages in your presentation was about the role of narcissists and kind of the cult that sometimes society and organizations pay to them. So I would like to ask you, what skills do you think young engineers, starting right now, should cultivate to first collaborate better, act with empathy, and deal with narcissist personalities or these type of managers that are micromanaging a lot?
Narcissism is evolutionarily adaptive. And at some level of the population, probably can't be eradicated. It's like it's a good hack, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a narcissist, I mean, I can say whatever I want. Like narcissists don't know that they are narcissists. They're also not listening to this. So they're not amenable to advice. So if you're a narcissist, stay away from me. And by this, I mean the clinical definition, not the shorthand that people use to describe people they don't like and declare them narcissists. There's a real mental pathology that people can have.
Mm-hmm.
They're out there and they're real for sure. Okay, but let's assume that you are not like that and you want to get ahead. I would say don't try to be like that. First of all, because it's wrong. It's just like the wrong way to be as like a person. And I think that's enough of a reason to not resort to grandstanding or saying that team of people is a pack of losers and we're the real smart people over here. If you feel even the slightest pang of guilt in doing that, you are not a narcissist and you should stop. With that established, maybe that kind of thing works a little bit, but it's wrong. And that's enough of a reason to stop. So what else is there to do? Well, I think just take other teams seriously, make friends with them, try and figure out how you can work together better. The person I'm thinking about right now is like somebody I promoted to principal engineer at Mozilla. And the way that I got his packet to be really strong was like he ultimately had this extremely outsized impact on marketing growth, which is the thing, like he didn't do anything technically complicated. There's nothing that he did that any one of hundreds of engineers couldn't have done. The only thing he did was, with my permission and encouragement to go do this, was go talk to all these people in marketing, understand their problems, and let's figure out how to do it. And read a bunch of manuals, just really basic crap that nobody had bothered to do, because the default would have been to consider that, well, it's marketing stuff. And by marketing stuff, I mean, make sure that the pipes are connected so that if somebody buys something from an ad campaign, we know that that happens. It's just basic fundamentals. There's nothing technically complicated at all. Promoting that person was easy because everybody was his biggest fan. By the end, the entire company was screaming for him to be promoted. I was imagining the fights I might need to have, or a very like, you know, different kind of programmer objecting and being like, was this really technically hard? Like, did he invent rope with this or whatever? It's like, no, he didn't invent anything. The only thing he did was take people seriously. The question I have is, why has nobody else done this? Why is he the first one among hundreds of people to solve this problem just by like hearing people out, right? And I think like that's that. Then maybe it's like a pathological situation, but everywhere I've worked has had the pathological situation between marketing and engineering. That's a place where you can distinguish yourself in ways that benefit you and the company you work for, and ideally the company you work for is not building bombs or selling cigarettes to orphans or anything like that. If you're doing any of those things, do the opposite of everything I say.
I can see what you're saying in a way that sometimes in engineering we try to do, and it feels good to do the algorithmic approach and try new tools. But then there are basic things, as you mentioned, for example, talking to the people in the other tribe or taking them seriously, that actually move the organization forward, and nobody incentivize you to do it.
The easiest thing in the world for me to do is just like, hey, whatever else you're doing, don't worry about it. Go talk to marketing and figure out what they need. Let's try and make this ad campaign not be a debacle this time.
Right. It doesn't sound fancy, but it was necessary. And the question, and I think it's relevant, like even it's so simple. Why nobody was seeing this as something relevant? Like why was not an incentive, organizational incentive to create, or to people to take, not to create a position because it comes top down, to people to go and talk to marketing. And I think that's very positive.
A million different reasons, but nobody in this story is evil or anything. It's just like the incentive's not there. Every other time before that, it's like we did that marketing campaign. You know, what happened? Well, something was broken. We're just never going to know. And then, you know, Spider-Man meme of Spider-Man pointing at each other would ensue. And then we just continue on like before. The incentive wasn't there to really make it work. So
do you think that the incentives only needs to come from like top to bottom? How we can create organizations that actually
by incentive, if you are an engineer working on this or whatever, it's like the archetypes that you have at certain companies are probably skewed in one direction. This was true at Etsy when I was promoted to principal engineer there too. It was like, you got to be a top quant like McKinley, or you need to be a gearhead K-er and can debug in disassembly or whatever. It's like these archetypes that you promote, right? Nobody at that company had been promoted for a business result. So nobody was trying to get it. They were all trying to get promoted by inventing programming languages. Not literally that, but the model they had in their head was the person who invented JavaScript or Rust. Like, I'm going to be like that. And that's a crowded field. There are other ways to have impact if you just like get out from under like the mass of C++ programmers and stand somewhere else. You can be recognized for doing something else, which can be really.
I see it. That's a really good piece of advice, and I honestly appreciate your openness. In the first message I sent you to LinkedIn, I know you're pretty busy, to share your thoughts and your experience with us here and Stanford and other places. I've been checked on my small podcast. Dan, I appreciate you this time. If it will be great to have you in the future. Pretty sure that more questions on organizational behavior at the intersection with engineering, which is kind of weird, but it is important, will come up for us to talk.
Yeah. Yeah, it was great. Nice meeting you. Good luck with the podcast and all.
Thank you so much.